Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is Dr. Rivkah Adler. I am coming to you from my home just east of Jerusalem in Ma'ale Adumim, Israel. It is a beautiful day here, and we are learning with a root source together. We are learning on the Women in the Bible channel. We are finishing today the very last lesson in the story of our biblical matriarch, Rivka, who is spoken about primarily in the book of Genesis in chapters 24 through 28. Today's class is a little bit different in that there's actually a lot of overview going on today, and I wasn't really sure what to show you, what you can look at. So I wanted to just show you this. It isn't the greatest picture. This actually used to hang in my home. This is a picture from an orange crate for Rivkah brand oranges, and I once bought this print and framed it in my home in America. I had a little collection of art that depicted the biblical character of Rivka, and I came across it when I was looking for an image to share with you, and I wanted just to share that with you. What my intention is today is to finish up this whole very long unit on Rivka, the matriarch Rivka, by looking at two things. Number one, what can we deduce about her personality based just on the text? What can we learn about her life based on the verses that in which she is spoken about without commentary? And so I'm not sure if I will be able to do this in the way that I have in mind, but I would like to start out. Let's see how this goes. I'm in chapter 24, verse 16. You know, if you have a Bible nearby, you may want to follow along, because the very first thing that we learn about Rivka in chapter 24, verse 16, is that she was beautiful, or as it says in this verse, now the maiden was very fair to look upon. And so that's just very simply the very first thing that we learn about her. Following up a few verses later, chapter 24, verse 18, we learn about her kindness and humility. She is here speaking to Eliezer, and she doesn't realize it, but Eliezer has been sent to find a wife, and she says, "Drink, my lord," and she quickly lowered her jug to her hand and gave him drink. This is chapter 24, verse 18. So we see that she is both kind and humble. The kindness, of course, is in the fact that she's physically working in order to satisfy him, and the humility in that he is a stranger to her, but she calls her my lord. I'm just going to share with you, I see this picture does not come out well. That might be a little bit better. I hope that you can see that you can't see the full thing. This is, I think, a nice picture of Rivka in her dignity. You can see her jug here. That's one of the things that she's very, very well known for. And we'll just rest this here. We see that in chapter 24, verses 19 and 20, that she is also a hardworking and industrious young woman. So when she finished giving him drink, she said, "I will draw water even for your camels until they have finished drinking." So she hurried and emptied her jug into the trough and came running to the well to draw water, and she drew for all his camels. We spoke about this before. That was not a simple kind of a task that she took on upon herself. That was a lot of work. And so we see that she was hardworking and industrious. We also see in this chapter in verse 25, she says to Eliezer, she's inviting him to her home, and she says, and the text says, "And she said to him, even straw and feed is plentiful with us, as well as a place to lodge." And so some of her generosity of spirit comes in this verse. We jump ahead later in this chapter, where there is a decision to be made about whether or not she will go with Eliezer to this place that she is not aware of. And we see in chapter 24, verse 58, they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" And she said, "I will go." We see that in this verse she is decisive and she's able to self-determine certain things. And that, of course, becomes much clearer as her story plays out. But at this point, she's still a young woman. In this same chapter, in verse 61, we see her modesty, both in verse 61 and 65. Then Rebekah arose with her maidens. They rode upon the camels and proceeded after the man. The servant took Rebekah and went. The concept that she proceeded after the man is an indication of her modesty. But reading forward in verse 65, and she said to the servant, who is that man walking in the field toward us? And the servant said, he is my master. This is at the moment where she meets Yitzhak, where she meets Isaac, who is going to be her husband for the very first time. And she took the veil and she covered herself. This is again an indication of her modesty. And in the very last verses of this chapter, chapter 24, we see that she is seen as spiritually powerful as her deceased mother-in-law Sarah. And it says in verse 67, and Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother. He married Rebekah. She became his wife, and he loved her, and thus Isaac was consoled after his mother. We see that in this verse, the very fullness of the fact that she is able to replace Sarah, who had big shoes in the spiritual world, that she herself was able to replace her mother-in-law. Moving on to chapter 25, just to review, in chapter 25, verses 22 and 23, we see this is the point at which she is pregnant, and she goes to find out what is going on with this pregnancy. And the text says, the children agitated within her, and she said, if so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of God. And God said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 regimes from your inside shall be separated. The might shall pass from one regime to the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. This is the essence. This is the prophecy that we spoke about the last couple of weeks. This prophecy that the elder will serve the younger, that had her later in life, after her children are grown, go to the extent that she went to in order to make sure that the younger one had the better blessing. In chapter 25, verse 28, there's another reference to these 2 children as they are older. The verse says, Isaac loved Esau, for game was in his mouth, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And so we see that the family dynamic is very clearly discussed in the text itself without any need for rabbinic commentary. Now, we may not have discussed this issue in great detail, but I'm jumping ahead to chapter 26, verse 7, where we see again Isaac has settled in Gerar, which is actually connected to modern day Gaza, the area that we refer to as the Gaza Strip, in that area. And the men of the place asked about his wife. He said, she is my sister, for he was afraid to say my wife, lest the men of the place kill me because of Rebekah, for she is fair to look upon. This, of course, is very, very familiar to us because we know the story from when Abraham traveled with Sarah, and it repeats itself in the next generation. So we are once again looking at a text that tells us that how very physically beautiful she was, in addition to how spiritually powerful she was. Jumping ahead to chapter 27, I am now looking at chapter 27 at verse 5. This we've discussed in great detail. Now Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to Esau his son, and Esau went to the field to hunt game to bring. Now, is she, in fact, actually eavesdropping? Because there is, of course, an association here with Sarah, that Sarah also was eavesdropping when the angels were talking to her husband Abraham. But of course, as I shared with you a few weeks ago, she wasn't necessarily eavesdropping in an evil way. Either her intention was she so cherished the words of her husband, or that she wasn't actually hearing with her ears, she was understanding with Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration. Jumping ahead to this whole section, I'm not going to read these verses, but I will point you to chapter 27, verses 6 through 17. We see that she is a risk taker. We've established that she takes charge. She knows what's proper regarding the birthright, which child should be the heir, because of the prophecy that she heard when she was pregnant, and she's willing to take a huge risk with her son's future to do what she believes is right. And in verse 13, where Yaakov is very reluctant to move in this direction. She says to him, "Your curse is on me." She takes, if something bad should happen, I take full responsibility. That is an indication of her bravery and of her dramatic spiritual certainty that this course of events is the course of events that has to take place. Now, later in this chapter, starting with verse 42, and I won't read all of these verses, this is where she clearly takes things into her own hands. She sets up the whole situation so that her husband will agree to send their son away in order to first get the extra blessing and also to go get a wife who is not from among the local idol worshippers. If you are at all familiar with the story of Fiddler on the Roof, this is reminiscent, or that story is reminiscent of this story, where there's a match made and then a song where a dream sequence where Tevye, the main character in Fiddler on the Roof, is able to persuade his wife that their daughter should marry someone else. Anyway, that's an aside. I want to conclude this whole unit on Rivka with 5 questions. I'm going to call these white spaces in the Torah. Or white spaces in the text. What do I mean? Here are some questions that I'm left with at the end of the story of Rivka. Questions that I'm left with that I just don't have answers for. One of them is, why does Rivka never appear to be told about the binding of Isaac? She comes into Isaac's life after the binding is over, and there's no indication that she knows the very dramatic and traumatic experience that her husband had. And we also don't know exactly what happened when they met. We know that she covered her veil. We know that he took her into the tent. There's different opinions about whether they were intimate immediately or if some time passed, because there is, of course, an opinion, I think I shared this with you, that Rivka was really very, very young, like much too young, physically immature, and not yet able to have children. But I'm curious as a woman, I'm curious as a person who studies the Bible, how they, having this arranged marriage, really, because neither of them had met each other before, and now they're together for life, what that was like. It's also curious to me how she passes from being of such fine character in her father's household to being capable of deceiving her husband and imposing her view of who should be the successor of the covenant on both her husband and her son. Now, there's a positive way to look at this and a less positive way to look at this. We understand that Rivka was driven by the motivation of the prophecy that she received, but still she had to take tremendous risk and be much less forthcoming about the relationship between her sons and her husband and so forth, and she took all of that on herself. And in the beginning of her story, she's such a pure innocent, and she develops into a woman who is capable. I'm not saying in any way that it's malicious in any way, God forbid, but that she does become a dramatic figure and a dramatic actor in her own story. And I'd also like to know how she responds to her own barrenness, because like all of the biblical matriarchs, with the exception of Leah, Rivka is, of course, goes through a period of barrenness. And I guess my last question, and with this we'll end because we're running quite late, is how she saw what her husband did not see, and she acted without his knowledge, without his consent. Sarah also saw what Abraham did not regarding the nature of his two sons, but she was able to get him involved in the process. And so it's curious to me, and I just leave you with this question, what that says about the differences in their marriages. Sarah and Abraham seem to have been a different kind of partner than Rivka and Yitzchak, and we see that in the different ways that the wife, who in both cases was a very powerful spiritual woman, dealt with dealt with her husband. With that, my friends, we are concluding this unit on Rivka, and we will pick up again next time with the story of the next generation in this biblical family of Rachel and Leah, of Rachel and Leah. And until then, I wish you all the best. Thank you for joining me. Be well. Bye.